ADHD fundamentally is a brain disorder. That's not the whole story, because what you see with a child, and I'm going to talk about children predominantly, I hope that's all right.
Yeah.
What you see predominantly in a child with a diagnosis of ADHD is a child trying to live with ADHD. So just saying it is a brain dysfunction is not entirely the whole picture, unless you're an absolute radical neuropsychologist when everything is the brain. I'm not sure it is. So you're normally seeing somebody where bits of the brain just aren't working as they should. So it's a deficit syndrome. And in particular, I argued last time, what functional brain scans show us, fMRI and the like, is that the front of the brain, the bit above your eyes, just isn't working as well as it should. It has less blood flow, it uses less oxygen, and the extraordinary thing is if you feed it with pills by getting its owner to swallow them, those bits start to function. You have a child whose brain, particularly at the front, which is the bit of the brain that does social judgment, that does working memory, that does general control of appropriate behaviour, which is where social judgment comes in, the bit that restrains impulses just isn't up to scratch. So that's the starting point. And that if you give medicines, particularly stimulant medicines, then that bit of the brain starts to function. Now, the reason why it isn't functioning as well as it should is because it's developing more slowly. What is happening is the surface of the front of the brain is slow to grow in children with ADHD. It's about 2 years behind. One is dealing, if you're a child with ADHD, with a brain that just hasn't grown well enough in the bits that count. If you're going to behave at school, if you're going to understand and think about what you've just heard and seen, that's short-term memory and working memory. If you're going to stop yourself doing what seems like a very good idea at the time but probably isn't in the long term, and those sorts of things. And although medicines can't accelerate the development of what I'm going to call the frontal, for obvious reasons, brain cortex, that's the outer layer of the brain, can't accelerate that development, but it can compensate for it. And by and large, a fair proportion of people outgrow their fundamental deficits in ADHD, though not all, of course, as they move through the teenage years and the young adult years. And the older you get, the fewer folk with ADHD there are, generally speaking. I'm talking in broad outlines, and it doesn't always completely clear up once. So my starting point is to say the reason for medicines is to make the brain work so that it can learn. And you could argue that folk like Nice got it wrong by saying, well, you should do parent psychoeducation, parent training, all those words first. You could argue that it should go the other way around. You should get the brain working first and then do the training of the children and family later. It is just possible that the new NICE might recognise that. It's currently under discussion. So the sort of argument that says ADHD parents don't know how to do it, therefore train them up and then you won't have a problem, hasn't really, well, it hasn't garnered much public appeal, I have to say, and I don't think I want to go there. But my focus, because I'm a medical practitioner, because I'm a medical doctor, is to focus on what I know about, which happens to be medicines. I'm not saying that medicines is suitable for everybody or does everything, it doesn't, but I think they have a very important role to play in general. And it has to be in general because the way we recognise ADHD is through observed behaviour. the diagnosis, as it were, in other words, the recognition, is made on the basis of what other people say about a child, which is a weak way of doing things. Nevertheless, even if one approaches the problem in that very crude way, we will make a diagnosis of what is physiologically wrong with a child on the basis of what people say about them. Nevertheless, medicine seemed to work for most. And I'll come back to what most means, definitely. So that's where I am in terms of medicines. I should have perhaps said something right at the beginning and didn't. Can I just slip it in here? There is no way I am drumming up business. I'm not looking for referrals. I have actually at the moment closed my books. The meds fall into two major groups. The stimulants and the non-stimulants. The stimulants break down into methylphenidate. Do you really want me to spell methylphenidate? MPH. And Dex. The methylphenidate lot you will know about. There's the ordinary immediate release methylphenidate preparations, the Ritalins, Tranquilins, God knows what the other ones are, Medicanet, and so on. So I'm going to call that immediate release methylphenidate. A small white tablet, you swallow it, and in half an hour it starts to work or thereabouts, and after an hour you've got peak blood level and it lasts about 3 to 3.5 hours if you're lucky. You've got the Equisim XL, Medicanet, XL, all the bunch that last for a morning or thereabouts. And you've got the other lot. I'm going to leave myself a bit of space. The Concerta that everyone knows about. And that is actually the correct way to pronounce it, unless you're in Italy. The Matarides. XL again. What's right around your patch? It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's much cheaper than Concerta XL. It does effectively the same job. It's a slightly simplified tablet, whereas the Concerta tablet is really quite complex and releases methylphenidate essentially in 3 waves. A Mataride releases in 2 waves, but it doesn't seem to matter. You get the same blood levels per hour, and it is 20% cheaper. And certainly some CAM services and paediatric services are using it in preference because of that. Medicanet XL lasts 6 to 8 hours, in theory. The great advantage of Medicanet XL is it gives you a boost in the morning. So that what you get, if you look at blood levels, which I caution against slightly, but you get a rise in blood level in the morning and then a rise in the afternoon. It's 50-50. So you get 50% of the capsule in the first 3 to 4 hours. Now, for some schools and some children, that's actually rather important because some schools will put all their academic stuff in the morning, and in the afternoon you just do sport or muck about or do whatever, but sometimes less demanding stuff. It isn't always true, of course, but when you've got that, that's actually quite useful. Equisim XL does something different. There's a little punch in the morning and a big punch in the afternoon. The reason for that is because that is what happens if you give immediate release twice a day. If you take Ritalin, ordinary Ritalin, at 7:30 in the morning and at midday, that is the blood curve you get. And I was one of the people who designed Equisim XL. I do not have shares in any pharmaceutical company. I'm not interested in how many they sell. It's not my bag. But I was roped into designing that. And this is a long time ago. More than 25 years ago. And we said, well, the best thing we can do is match twice daily Ritalin. Well, we were wrong. That's not the best thing to do. The best thing to do would be to match 3 times daily Ritalin, but we didn't know that. because this was before the MTA trial, which showed that if you're going to give Ritalin or an immediate release, you give it 3 times a day. So 7:30, 11:30, 2:30, that sort of patch. But we try to match that. And many people, many clinics think this is good stuff. I must say, I tend to use quite a bit of Medicanet XL because Equisim XL doesn't really do much in the morning. It doesn't quite, the mixture isn't quite right. Whereas Medicanet gives a good punch in the morning, it's not quite so good in the afternoon because it's a German drug and it's tailored to the German school day, which sort of packs up at 1:30. That's the way they do it.
Yeah.
Concerta XL, Matarite XL will claim to go 8 to 12 hours. You may be unlucky on that score, but they're much more protracted. But that's relatively new. Dex comes in 2 forms basically. One is ordinary immediate release Dex. Small white tablet, you take it, it lasts fractionally longer than methylphenidate, and some people therefore like it because it's a bit smoother. If you're using immediate release, instead of getting the sort of switchback effect that you do if you keep plugging a Ritalin or a Medicanet into somebody, that Dex lasts just that little bit longer, and you give it twice a day, and you don't have to give it 3 times a day. So it has some advantages, though it's very little used in this country. Or there is an extended release form, which is called Adderall, which is not easily available in this country. You can get it if you want to, but you will pay through the nose. It's never been released over here, not for safety reasons, but because the company, who are Shire, although the patents ran out on that one, just didn't think the market was big enough to justify releasing it. If you want to release a medicine, if you're an American company, actually Shire is a British company, it's now an Irish company, never mind. I've known Shire since it was 4 guys in a garage in Andover. They changed that story, I hear recently, and they now say it was 2 guys in a flat above an off licence.
So sexy on the big.
Yeah, I think that it's now the 7th biggest pharma company in business or something. Adderall, if you want to launch Adderall, you make Adderall in the States, or if you're Shire, you buy it off a company called Richwood. I helped them buy it. I can tell you that. I said, you ought to get into this. There's a long personal anecdote about all that, which shows you what an idiot I was. If I just stopped medicine at that point and bought shares in Shire, I would have arrived by helicopter. But doctors aren't allowed in this country to own shares in pharma companies, just as well. Adderall, developed in the States, if you want to bring it over to Europe, it has to get through the European Medicines Agency, or the MHRA, the regulatory bodies. Not, you make a drug, you've got to show to one of these bodies, the quangos essentially, that the stuff is safe, that it works, and it can be manufactured to a consistent standard. And I've worked on both the EMA and the MHRA, and those are the questions that are asked. Does this stuff work? Is it safe? And can you actually make it properly? There are a few other questions that get asked, but those are the 3 things that have to be fulfilled. To show that it works, you carry out clinical trials. If you carry out clinical trials on American children, that won't wash in Europe. And the reason for that is essentially that the prevalence of ADHD as diagnosed by American physicians is about 11% of the population, child population. The prevalence of ADHD as diagnosed by Europeans, and Europeans here means Brits, Germans and Scandinavians. We don't go south of Austria for lots of reasons. The prevalence in Europe is about 2%. So the American ADHD condition is different, it's milder by and large. For example, there is a rating scale which is very commonly used for trials, which is the ADHD rating scale. You get a score on that. If you score 54, you're as bad a case as ADHD as anyone has ever thought of. It's really big, bad score, 54. If you get 0, nobody exists at 0 unless they're a girl. You know, that's a terribly, terribly well-behaved, well-controlled person who never steps out of line. Yeah, that's right. Universal. You know, so you've got a scale that goes from 0 to 54. The American cutoff is 28. You want to recruit ADHD kids into a trial, they've just got to hit 28 on an ADHD rating scale. The children seen in ADHD clinics in this country are nearly always above 40, and usually above 45. So we recognise a more severe picture. So if you carry out a trial in the States, you're treating much milder children and it's easier to get a result, you can argue. Are you with me? So the Americans are interested in American trials, but they don't rely on them to sanction medicines. So they want European trials. Now, okay, let's do a European trial. Let's cost it up. Oh, it's likely, all in all, once you've done it properly, to cost you between £1.3 and £500,000 sterling. So that is approaching €750,000 to do a European trial. So that is why Adderall never got launched in this country. They would have had to carry out a trial. It would have been very expensive, and it would have been very difficult if we go back to the late 1980s, because nobody in this country knew how to do large-scale trials. It just wasn't in the system. So it never got launched. It's not a safety issue, and Adderall is a good drug. But it's not over here officially. You have to pay anyone using Adderall, on their children, let us say. Well, it's of the order of £800 a month. It's that sort of level. So not a lot of people are going to do that. Unless they are Americans who have American health insurance where they get 80% of their drug costs refunded. That makes a difference. But British health insurance companies don't do that. So dexamfetamine, by and large, is immediate release. Now there's an interesting twist to that has happened in the last fortnight. You will be hearing these things first here. There's a liquid form. There is now a liquid form of dexamfetamine. I saw the first mail shot about that 3 weeks ago. And that's now out. So there is a liquid, it's not just the white tablets. Now that's helpful. And I should mention that it's also the case that although there has been a liquid form of methylphenidate, it's now a lot easier to get hold of. So there is a 5 milligram per 5 ml liquid form of immediate release now. So both these immediate releases come as a tablet and as a liquid, and this IR here, ditto, tab and liquid. This is a blessing, frankly, because there are so many children who just can't swallow tablets. So these are out there. The one I just forgotten to mention, the one I don't think is very good, is Zenidate XL, spelled with an X. And the reason, your Concerta capsule, I just called it a capsule because it looks like a capsule. Technically it's a tablet, don't ask me why. The thing you take, the Concerta XL thing, pill, is a little cylinder. It looks like a depth charge if you're into naval history. And on the outside, there is a coating of methylphenidate. There's a tiny little hole at the top which you can't see. It's absolutely minuscule. They go on a lot about it being laser drilled. Who cares? It's very small. The outside layer is methylphenidate. So that when you swallow it, the first thing that happens is the outside layer of this cylindrical pill dissolves off, and you get your first release of methylphenidate. Sorry, done too much work with Americans. They call it methylphenidate. Some of the people I like call it mouthful phenidate. This dissolves off. That's your first wave. So you go like that. That's your blood level going up over the first 3 hours or so, 4 hours. Then what happens is that, I'll just draw the bottom of it. This is exposed now. That's dissolved off. That's all gone away. And you're left with an inner shell. Now that inner shell is a semi-permeable membrane. I'm looking for all those people who are nodding, because that means osmosis. So what happens in osmosis is that water is sucked in from the gut. There are up to 10 litres of fluid slushing around your guts every day. So water is absorbed from what is around in your gut into here. That then pushes up a diaphragm, a washer, a seal here, because the water coming in displaces this dot upwards. Then what happens is that pushes a second wave of methylphenidate out of the hole. So the water being sucked in through this membrane here, what remains of the tablet once the outer skin has dissolved off, pushes this layer upwards, which pushes that out. So you get your second wave, which again lasts about 4 hours. After that, although there isn't a compartment here as such, there's a different layer of stuff which is a bit more powerful. So I've drawn it slightly different. Again, it's methylphenidate, but in a higher concentration, and that gives you your third wave, and then it all packs up. Well, by that stage, of course, this has swollen, but it doesn't actually keep packing. But it packs up at that stage. So that's what the Concerta tablet is all about. So it's all about sucking fluid in to displace stuff out. It's clever stuff, which means it can go wrong. And one of the things that Janssen, who make it, are now cottoning on to is that some people's guts are different from other people's guts. And there are people around, and you may know some, who take Concerta and say it doesn't work reliably. Some days it works, some days it doesn't work. And that's probably because there is something about the way they keep their intestines that means that this rather complicated system gets hung up at some point. And nobody knows what it is, but it is now recognised. It doesn't always work terribly well. That is Concerta. Mataride does exactly the same thing, up to a point. It has an outer layer of methylphenidate, which dissolves off. Then once that's dissolved off and exposes a membrane, an intact membrane, by osmosis, water is drawn in, and that expels the second wave of methylphenidate. It doesn't have this moderately concentrated and heavily concentrated phase system, but it doesn't seem to matter. If you actually look at the curves in the blood, they are pretty well the same. That puzzles me, and it puzzles the pharmacists that I work with. We don't understand why it should be about the same. And it's probably because this was somebody's good idea. That's it. It probably doesn't need to be as complicated. That's Mataride and Concerta. Zenidate works on a different system.
Is this the one you don't like?
The one I don't like. The reason I don't like it is because the company who make it have not released any blood level data, but they expect me to prescribe it. And that means I've got to take it on board what they say. They say it's the same. And I'm not convinced. Until they release the data, I'm not going to prescribe it, frankly. But it is dirt cheap. And it's a different system, whereby, like Equisim XL and like Medicanet XL, you have a capsule. And a capsule is a thing in a little cellulose membrane which dissolves. The thing about Concerta and Mataride is that the whole tablet shell doesn't dissolve, and if you have a child who's particularly interested in dissecting their own feces, they may find the shell and panic. Yeah, yes, you can see them. And if you don't tell people what they are, they begin to get ideas. I usually tell them it's exactly the same as Find My iPhone. Your parents have got this little thing in your gut so they know where you are the whole time.
Good one.
I'm sure that's going to happen within.
Probably.
It's my idea.
Yeah.
What happens with Zenidate? And for that matter, Medicanet XL, and for that matter, Equisim XL, is that you have an ordinary capsule, and within that you have two sorts of beads. If you open the capsule, you see little grains
Got
of
one if
things.
you want one.
Are straightforward beads of medication that are methylphenidate and are absorbed almost immediately. Half in Medicanet, or 2/3 in Equisim XL, are covered in wax. And the heat of the body melts the wax, and about 4 hours later, they are just like that, and they can then be released. And Zenidate and Medicanet XL and Equisim XL all use the same system. It's much simpler. Tends to work. But Zenidate XL is 1/5 of the price of Concerta XL. And in some parts of the country, if you go and look at Zenidate XL online, you'll find some pharmacy committees have instructed all their GPs to switch people from Concerta XL to Zenidate XL immediately because of cost. You can Elvance in most of Europe, except Ireland, where it's Tyvance, Venvance in Brazil, Vyvanse in North America, is Lisdexamfetamine. Spot the F again. And it's an interesting stuff. It's interesting stuff because, as it stands, it doesn't do anything. It's inert, completely inert. It's a bit like a memory stick. A memory stick, as you and I buy them in the shop, you can't use. You have to pull the cap off. And in this substance, the cap is called lysine. It's an amino acid which I'm sure is deeply wonderful, but doesn't do anything pharmacologically. And when you swallow lisdexamfetamine, it's absorbed into the gut, but from the gut into the bloodstream. It's not doing anything. It just doesn't do anything. But in the bloodstream, in the portal bloodstream, to be absolutely specific, which goes from the gut to the liver, the red cells, the red blood cells, that normally all red blood cells do is carry oxygen around. I mean, it's not exactly a taxing task. But to my great surprise, they contain an enzyme that splits off lysine, which is, for reasons unknown, spelled differently. Once that's split off, this stuff can go careering around the rest of the bloodstream, get into the brain and do its biz. Now that's a gradual process. That's the important thing about it. So you have an inert molecule that's absorbed across the gut wall into the blood, where there are red cells, and because of those red cells, it splits into a bit like that, a bit like that. That's lysine. It's no use. It's just disposed of. It's peed out, basically. and you've got the dexamphetamine, which actually does the biz. But this takes time, and it takes for every capsule of Velvance, it takes about 13 hours for that process to happen. So you've got a sustained release preparation, but working through a different mechanism to all these complicated pills and capsules with things inside. Because the slow action of splitting off the dex from the lysine is rate limited. It happens slowly and gradually across a large number of hours in most people. Does that make sense? The dex, when all is said and done, goes on and then does what it should do. It's releasing within an hour of you taking it. I mean, you swallow it, it kicks in gently. What teenagers tell me is they usually say, I like this stuff, it's popular. Not always. It makes some people tense.
What about sleeping on it afterwards?
That can be a problem. That they say, I like it, but I don't notice it come in with a bang, like Methylphenidate XL, or immediate release Methylphenidate, or immediate release Dex for that matter. It's much more gentle, but I realise by lunchtime I've been working, and I haven't got detention, and those things. But because it goes on for quite a long time, there is a chance that it will keep them up all night, just as there is with concerta or Methylphenidate. And that is a potential drawback, though in teenagers it doesn't seem to be too much a hassle because they're hormones in any case.
Yeah, they are.
In 8 or 9-year-olds it can be, and that's a nuisance, so it's a drawback.
So this is better for teenagers than the younger?
Well,
Does it depend?
I tend to use it for teenagers, but I wouldn't say it's better. And plenty of folk in the States will say, no, you can use this for anyone, actually. And you can, but you've got to watch out for that, because it's quite a long duration action, but that isn't always the case.
Does it depend on your metabolism as to how long it works? Like with the concerta, I only get about 8 hours.
Yes.
And then I have to top up with the Ecrasem.
Well, 8 hours is about what the manufacturers say you should get up to concerta. But people vary. And I wrote out a script yesterday for a young man, who happens to be a 20-year-old, whom I've known for a very long time, who takes his Elvance twice a day. And I also, this week, wrote a letter. It was yesterday, I can't remember, signed it off yesterday, about a guy in Oxford whom I've known forever, who takes it twice a day. And the NHS folk in Oxford are going, you never give this twice a day. It doesn't say you can. For God's sake, he's different.
Yeah, everybody's different.
Quite, and that's
the
terribly
point,
important.
isn't it?
Yeah,
It's very
everybody
important.
is different. Thank goodness.
My son would take things.
So that's Elvance. I mean, shoot.
Sorry, I'm on Elvan.
Yeah.
I've been on it 3 months.
Yeah.
My daughter's on it as well, who's just learning to drive. And we looked up the driving thing that came out
Yep.
last March.
Yep.
Bit concerned.
No, don't be concerned. Don't be concerned about the driving thing. You have to take an awful lot of Elvance, like more than you would ever dream of taking, to get up to the level where that would get in the way of the driving brakes. I did know exactly what the levels were a year ago, but it's gone now.
I think it's 25 milligrams per 50.
If you really want to get to that level of Elvance, you're taking a dozen capsules. It's not going to happen. And your driving will improve. It will.
It does, after.
Whether there's a difference on appetite suppression, I don't think there's much difference, frankly. It's individual differences, horses for courses. Some people get it, some people don't get it, some people get it more on Dex, some people get it more on Methylphenidate.
And it can work.
Nerve cells in the brain, which there are an exceptionally large number, don't touch. They don't touch each other. But nerve impulses from one nerve cell do pass to another. So they do it, basically electrical impulses in one nerve cell gets to another nerve cell by chemical means. So the nerve cells in the brain don't touch each other. that's the first and most important, rather surprising thing I need to say. So you have a cell in the brain, spiky things coming off it, and one long spiky thing called an axon. And that ends here. And there is another nerve cell there, but there's a gap between the two. Is that okay so far? I'll rub it off then. Because that gap is called a synapse and is critical. At the end of that spike, you have something that looks like this. And you have this gap. And here's the other cell. To get an electrical impulse, which looks like that, going along the surface of this nerve cell, to get this nerve cell excited so that it in turn transmits a nerve impulse, this cell releases a chemical. And the chemicals that we are really interested in are dopamine and noradrenaline. This is not adrenaline. It's horribly like being back at school, isn't it? Dopamine is usually abbreviated to DA, noradrenaline to NA, or if you're American, NE, because they say norepinephrine. Most of what we're interested in, on the whole, tends to be dopamine, but there isn't a good reason for that, because both of these are important in the front part of the brain. The nerve cells in the front part of the brain rely heavily on these two. There are about a dozen other of these chemicals called neurotransmitters in other parts of the brain, but I don't suggest we go there. These are the two that are critical for nerve cells at the front of the brain, where all the business about impulse control, social judgment, short-term memory and so on are concentrated. And each nerve cell secretes one of these chemicals. And that goes from here, it's stored within the nerve cell, and then it's released across microseconds. It happens so quickly. Released across the gap, the synapse, and connects with the receptor. When it connects with the receptor, that kicks off the impulse. So it's chemical transmission. Now, the brain being good at what it does, once that, let's say it's dopamine. This is a dopamine nerve cell, a dopaminergic nerve cell. Once that has been released, gone across, kicked off by locking into a receptor, physically locks into a special space with a particular shape, that then kicks off the electrical impulse, so it's transmitted onto another nerve. It's then recycled. It drifts back out into the synapse space, which is tiny, tiny, and it's recycled. It's sucked back up again by a thing called the dopamine transporter. So it goes across, it does its biz in the receptor, and then it's released from the receptor back, then it's sucked back in again, so it's constantly recycled. What methylphenidate does, in the first instance, is block that. Methylphenidate, in the brain, does a dog in the manger act. It sits on the dopamine transporter, going yah-boo at the dopamine. You can't be taken back up again, you can't be transported back up again, I'm here. Musical chairs, I'm sitting on a chair, you cannot get on this chair. So it stops the reuptake of dopamine, which means there's more dopamine here, which means more receptors can get activated and more brain work gets done. And the brain of somebody with ADHD is short of dopamine. It hasn't got enough. It's the hypodopaminergic brain, if you want to use long words. It just hasn't got enough dopamine because it hasn't developed enough, blah, blah, blah. It hasn't got enough. So what methylphenidate does is block the reuptake so there's more kicking around the synapse, so you get more transmission, which is what you want. Does that make sense? Let's assume that it's a cell that runs on this stuff, noradrenaline. Now, this is possibly more important, although everyone talks about dopamine, there are more cells running on noradrenaline in the frontal cortex, this bit, than there are dopamine cells. Exactly the same thing happens. There's noradrenaline, it's being released, it goes across, it contacts a noradrenaline receptor and kicks this cell into action. And then it's sucked back up again by the noradrenaline transporter. And that, I would hang on to that because that's important. Now, the funny thing about that is that dopamine and noradrenaline can actually both be sucked up by much the same, by each other's transporter. It is sometimes said that the transporter molecules are promiscuous. That's how neurophysiologists think. But that they don't really mind that much when they're sucking up dopamine, but they'll suck up a bit of noradrenaline as well. And if they're a noradrenaline transporter, they'll suck up a bit of dopamine as well as the noradrenaline they're supposed to be at. So there's a bit of overlap between the two. But both, but methylphenidate will block, and DEX will block both dopamine and noradrenaline reuptake as it happens. Though the usual story you will hear is that it's all about methylphenidate and dopamine. And if you stick to that straightforward story, nobody is going to disagree with you. But if you really get into the literature, then it gets a little more complicated because nobody talks about noradrenaline, though it's probably more important. And both methylphenidate and DEX, methylphenidate and DEX will block both transporters. Now, having said that, DEX does something a bit naughty, which is good news. DEX not only blocks the noradrenaline reuptake, it actually doesn't just sit on the chair. I can't push the chair analogy any further. The chair turns into a stairlift or something, I don't know. But it actually persuades the transporter to move it inside the cell. The dopamine transporter and methylphenidate don't do that. The dopamine transporter just gets blocked. The noradrenaline transporter, if you put DEX on there, if you put noradrenaline on there, on the transporter, it does actually get sucked right into the cell and gets into these collections and displaces stuff out. So you get more bangs for your buck. I'll go into that if you really want me, because that's all to do, if you look it up on Wikipedia, it's very boring. Don't look at Wikipedia. They go on about TAR1, which is one of the enzymes. But you get rather more out of DEX because it gets inside the cell. Methylphenidate doesn't. When it gets inside the cell, it releases the stored noradrenaline from these little globules inside. So you get rather more going on. And when you do head-to-head trials, DEX versus methylphenidate, which is more powerful, there's often, but not always, a slight edge for DEX. And it's probably because of that it's doing stuff inside the cell as well as blocking reuptake. This is hard going, isn't it? So this is how stimulants work. Stimulants, methylphenidate and dexamphetamine, work by blocking the reuptake of neurotransmitters so that there's more available.